Tensions between America and South Africa seem to be escalating. And this is despite the announcement by President Ramaphosa that he made a call to Elon Musk. So if you've been following this story, you know that on Monday, South Africa was shocked by the announcement made by Donald Trump on Truth Social. What Donald Trump posted on Truth Social was the following: South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. It's a situation that the radical left media doesn't want to so much as mention. A massive human rights violation at a minimum is happening for all to see. The United States won't stand for it. We will act. Also, I will be cutting off all future funding to South Africa until a full investigation of the situation has been completed. This is what Donald Trump opened the conversation with. And since then, we've tried to see how different people are moving and responding to this particular development. But on the American side, it looks very clear that they are continuing to show that they have no appetite whatsoever for South Africa going forward. And I'm going to show you why that's the case. On Tuesday, though, we got a report that there was a call between President Cyril Ramaphosa and Elon Musk. And this came from a tweet that came from the presidency, and it said the following: Yesterday, on the 3rd of February 2025, President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke to Elon Musk on issues of misinformation and distortions about South Africa. In the process, the president reiterated South Africa's constitutionally embedded values of the respect for the rule of law, justice, fairness, and equality. So it seems as if there's an appreciation in the presidency, in the diplomatic circles, that you don't particularly want to have America cutting funding, cutting access to AGOA. These will have economic impact on South Africa. And even though there is an ideological point that South Africa stands for politically, stands for with the Expropriation Act, you want to maintain diplomatic relations, you want to maintain trade relations. However, Donald Trump is willing to blow all of that up. He's shown that with Colombia. He's shown that with tariffs on Mexico. These tariffs that didn't end up happening on Canada and Mexico. He's imposed tariffs on China. He's shown a willingness to tear up norms, tear up the global order in a way that he believes will protect American interests. And now South Africa is in those crosshairs. So it seems as if President Cyril Ramaphosa then tried to reach out to Elon, who we know is very close to Donald Trump, had been living in Mar-a-Lago, is somebody who is now, in charge of this Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, and is working on a variety of things like dismantling US aid. So he would be the right person to try to reach and correct the narrative. From this, it does not actually seem to me that the president made a lot of progress in talking to Elon Musk. Why do I say so? I say so because Elon continued to retweet and to comment on critical posts relating to South Africa. And he tweets a lot, he engages a lot. But if you go to his timeline on Twitter, you will see that some of the things that he platformed, therefore spreading them further to the global information pool, were things that were very critical of South Africa. Since then, since these developments on Monday and on Tuesday, we've seen more happening. We've seen Senator Ted Cruz making an announcement. We've seen Marco Rubio making an announcement, and they have relevant and important positions. We've seen the possible pick for American ambassador to South Africa, Joel Pollack, giving commentary and giving an interview to News 24, which was very critical. And we've also seen AfriForum, which is one of the organizations that people have speculated was actually involved in creating the narrative that South Africa is persecuting white South Africans and that South Africa is confiscating land from white South Africans there without doing so lawfully. AfriForum has been implicated in spreading that particular narrative. Some people have even called for them to be charged for treason, right? So the conversation in the Trump bubble of information seems to be very hostile to South Africa right now. And I think it shows that South Africa is in the crosshairs of the Trump administration beyond the issues of US aid. So let's look at what Marco Rubio said. And Marco Rubio is Secretary of State. It's a very important position within the American cabinet, so to speak. They don't use that term cabinet, but he sits in the executive, and this is what he said. And I want to point out that I mentioned this in the original video I made at the inauguration, where I said Trump snubs Ramaphosa, and some people were critical of that. But I did mention the G20 summit and America's attendance, that it's not likely to actually happen. So I thought Trump is not going to attend. He's been very demeaning of African nations. But now it seems even Marco Rubio is not going to attend. And Marco Rubio went onto social media, onto his Twitter, and he said the following things. And the things that he said show the tone from Trump, and they show how the Secretary of State will be approaching this particular this particular country, South Africa, as it pertains to American positions. This is what Marco Rubio said: "I will not attend the G20 summit in Johannesburg. South Africa is doing very bad things, expropriating private property, using G20 to promote solidarity, equality, and sustainability. In other words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and climate change. My job is to advance America's national interest, not to waste taxpayer money or coddle anti-Americanism." So their view is that South Africa is anti-America. That is where they stand right now. Ted Cruz, right, said the following. Now, he's a U.S. senator, but he also occupies another important position that we need to be aware of. Ted Cruz said the following: "The South African government seems to be going out of their way to alienate the United States and our allies. Their timeline to expel our Taiwanese allies from Pretoria is deeply troubling. It undermines the national security interests of America and our allies, and will deepen tensions between the United States and South Africa. I intend to use my position as the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to investigate these and other concerning decisions by South Africa." So right now, as you can see, you've got Trump is against South Africa. You've got Marco Rubio against South Africa. You've got Ted Cruz, who occupies the position of chairman of the Africa Subcommittee. So he's in Senate, the chairman looking at Africa, Ted Cruz. And he is going to investigate what he views to be an anti-America position from South Africa, right? The Taiwan issue is a complicated issue, but China maintains that Taiwan is part of China under its one China policy. So South Africa did cut diplomatic relations with Taiwan in 1997, but they let them maintain their offices in Pretoria, basically an embassy status. What has happened is that they've asked them to move out of Pretoria and to basically downgrade them from this embassy status without the embassy title to being something lesser. And now this is something that is directly at odds with the American position, because America recognizes Taiwan. And in fact, the chips are made by the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, TSMC. Now, these are the chips that are being used in Apple computers, used across the world. And China wants these chips, these silicon chips that are being made there, because these are the chips that give the computing power to all of these companies making the processors like NVIDIA and all of those. There's an interesting book called Chip War, which you should read about, which speaks about how Taiwan and the chip manufacturing sector is one of the most contested sectors and one of the areas which will possibly create a global conflict. So as you can see, the issue of Taiwan on the American radar is a significant one. And it seems to them that South Africa is leaning more to the Chinese direction. Obviously, South Africa is a country that does a significant amount of trade. And China also bullies other countries and makes them move away from any type of support to Taiwan. So China was able to pressure South Africa, right? And that kind of pressure also is pressure that we must address and call out as being problematic, because China came and said, well, you guys do a lot of trade with us, and if you want to maintain trade with us, you can't have a relationship with Taiwan. You can't continue to recognize Taiwan as an entity when it's part of China. And obviously, even if you are disagreeing with that position, even if you were, you would have to comply if you want to continue to do trade with China. Many companies, many countries make concessions to China because they recognize the economic might of China as things stand. So South Africa is between a rock and a hard place when it comes to this issue of China, of Taiwan rather. They are between what is it? What is the appropriate superhero reference? They're between Superman and not Batman. Batman would lose. Anyway, rock and a hard place. I'm going with rock and a hard place. So you can see where things are and where things stand. Then you have the potential U.S. ambassador to South Africa who did an interview with News 24. It came out 2 days ago. Now, here's what happened in that interview. Here's what he said. So the potential pick for U.S. ambassador to South Africa is a guy known as Joel Pollak, who has said that South Africa must abandon race-based policies and align with the U.S. on Israel and China if it is to continue to benefit from aid and special trade arrangements. So Pollak right now is the editor-at-large at Breitbart News, and he is an influential figure within the MAGA movement and is one of the people who has been vocal about the implications of the Trump administration for South Africa, and he's been very vocal about what is happening in South Africa. And he would have been able to be one of the voices that Trump and others are listening to. Breitbart News is one of the biggest right-wing platforms. And in fact, I think it was the biggest for a very long time, right? And contributed to Trump being elected in the first round where he won in 2016. So this is not a trivial person. It's a very influential person within the right-wing news ecosystem, he's a very respected person within that right-wing news ecosystem. We just need to be aware of that. And he's from South Africa. So Pollak was actually born in Johannesburg in 1977. His parents then left the country for the United States. He grew up in Chicago as a US citizen, and he returned to South Africa as an exchange student while at school. He has gone and spent time volunteering. He volunteered in Khayelitsha. He started a chess club there in Site C, which is one of the poorest areas in Khayelitsha. Then he returned to South Africa as an adult. And in that period of time, he worked for Tony Leon, who was then the leader of the Democratic Alliance, and he was in his office for 4 years, right? So for a significant amount of time, he was under the tutelage of Tony Leon, and obviously he still has a relationship with Tony Leon. While he was there, he met his future wife, Julia, who is a labor economist and the daughter of a prominent anti-apartheid activist, Rhoda Kadali, right? So he has an ear to South Africa. And I've seen what Tony Leon has been posting about expropriation and the Expropriation Act. And Tony Leon is very harsh. You know, the DA right now has been soft in their tone, etc., etc. But Tony Leon is very harsh. So if this guy is going with Tony Leon like this, that gives you an indication as well as to the tone that is being sent up to Donald Trump. So in an interview which he did with News 24 from California, Pollak said that Trump's seemingly out of the blue tweet, which we saw early on Monday but was tweeted on Sunday in America, was not unexpected, and that the new president has a coherent and long-standing desire to force change in South Africa. Asked about the limitations of the Expropriation Act, because the Expropriation Act only allows 4 types of compensation of expropriation without compensation. It's land that has been left undeveloped for speculative reasons, land that the property owners can no longer exercise control of, like an abandoned building in a CBD. It's land that is owned by an organ of state, but that organ of state no longer has a function for it. And number 4, it's land that the state already has developed more than the market value. Those are the 4 limitations within the Expropriation Act. So he was asked about this to say, look, the system is lawful, the system has structure. Why would you maintain a hostile position? And how would you think that there can still be, land taken by the state in an unlawful manner? This is what he said. I think it could happen. And given South Africa's long indulgence of Zimbabwe, it would be unreasonable to think it couldn't happen. The threat of expropriation has definitely discouraged American investment in South Africa. And I can say that with direct knowledge of people who are considering investing in South Africa and then chose not to because South Africa was not firm with Zimbabwe. So I don't think this is 100% correct. I'll tell you why. I think that the constitutional law system in South Africa is robust, and politicians have shown that they are willing to comply with court orders, whether they are DA, ANC, whatever the case may be. Even Jacob Zuma, who sometimes challenges the courts, has willingly taken himself through the legal system and abided by decisions. Sometimes Zuma will try to game the system, right? He'll try to get a pardon, get a parole, etc., etc. But he will play within the system by and large. And I think that remains true. So I don't think it's true that there's a risk of unlawful land seizures or anything going outside of the ambit of the act. Everybody has shown that they're willing to respect rule of law. Typically what happens in South Africa in terms of how the law can be sometimes smudged, not necessarily violated, is that certain people who've done wrong things don't get charged. Certain cases don't get adjudicated or put on the roll, etc., etc. So, for example, Thembisi Melane, the minister, who was Minister of Justice, who was then moved, is facing allegations that she took VBS linked money, not directly from VBS, but from a fixer and a middleman for VBS. She's not going to necessarily get charged anytime soon. We saw that there was reporting, and I think the reporting was very solid around the minister in the presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, and actions that she took when she approved a tender that had not been actually put to bid. So what happened in that story, and what I mean by this, a tender was put to bid, but the company that won had not actually put in a bid. That's what I meant to say. So because what basically happens is that there's a box outside the municipal area where you're supposed to deposit your tender application, and then they seal the box at a certain time, and that company didn't have a tender in the box, as per witnesses in two court cases have attested. But the company then still won the tender, and there was only one person who had the authority to sign that particular authorization, the municipal manager. That was Khumbudzo Ntshavheni. She signed, and she also sent the information that the company had won. The beef then started when the company didn't get paid the full amount that they thought they were owed. Then they took each other to court, and then at some point the municipality was like, anyway, this was an unlawful tender, we're not going to pay. And the courts ruled in their favor twice. And one of the things that happened is that the judge who was adjudicating this case actually said, I'm going to refer the municipal manager to the Hawks, and that municipal manager needs to be investigated. So there's the file somewhere in the system, as per the reports, but there have been no charges. So that's an example of how the system works. Those ministers will not necessarily get fired as long as they remain in the good graces of whoever it is that they need to remain in the good graces of. So that's how sometimes rule of law doesn't work in South Africa. So I don't think it's true. I almost dropped the mic. Don't think it's true that it's going to happen the way that Pollack is talking about. But I think it is true that South Africa has been maintaining very cozy relationships with Zimbabwe that sometimes can make people concerned. Look at Fikile Mbalula, he's very cozy with ZANU-PF officials, very cozy with Emerson Mnangagwa, all of these dudes. And then also President Ramaphosa did attend the inauguration in Zimbabwe. So sometimes when you look at that, you can get like a little bit, why are you so close to ZANU-PF, Frelimo? These are corrupt entities which don't necessarily respect rule of law. And ZANU-PF did seize land without any compensation. I don't think that the proximity to ZANU-PF that the ANC sometimes displays, though, means that they're willing to go and do the foolish thing that ZANU-PF did, because they appreciate that that will never work. It won't work in South Africa. The constitutional framework is too strong. So I think that the critique of the relationship with Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF, is fair, but the conclusion is unreasonable, if that makes any sense. So what he then further on said is that the risk that they have assessed is that South Africa's philosophical orientation is generally towards redistribution, whether it has the legal mechanisms to do so or not. He said, generally, when you look at the political debate in South Africa, it's very much about redressing the past, and the world is tired of it. The world has moved on. They want to know how South Africa will build a better future. This is what he said. Quick comment on this as well. I always think that it's unreasonable to ask South Africans to move on when some of the issues that were supposed to be resolved in 1994 were not resolved in 1994. After World War II happened, certain countries got reparations. They got reparations for the damage that had been caused by Germany, and they were able to then move on, right? In South Africa, some of the atrocities and the injustices, the Glenn Gray Act, the Land Act of 1913, the Group Areas Act, and also which other one am I forgetting? There's another one that I'm forgetting. But all of these acts that deprive people of land were never rectified in 1994. They never were. And the ANC also failed to do certain things, right? And now Ramaphosa is trying to reset the clock, etc., etc. And some of it is for political survival. Some of it is. But to us, the public that never actually saw the benefits and never saw the restoration, and often were being asked to just overlook certain things and agree to just embrace the Rainbow Nation, I think it's unreasonable to ask people to do that. Right? It's unreasonable to ask people to do that. But he may be looking at it from his perspective, and that perspective is coming from being a white person living in America, having been somebody who never really was affected by some of the atrocities that were committed by the apartheid regime. And as such is saying the things that he's saying. So that's just a quick comment. I wanted to make that. And also, according to Pollack, there are wide-ranging concerns about South Africa from the American side. This is what he said. A general and widely held sentiment is that South Africa is not cooperating with the United States on the international stage. Even Democrats have been asking why South Africa is included in AGOA if it constantly helps Russia at a time when Russia is disrupting the international order with war in Ukraine and by essentially offering aid and comfort to Hamas. That is universal and not just on the right. AfriForum also has participated in this conversation, and they have actually called for sanctions against South African political leaders. Now, the reason why they've kind of gone for sanctions is because I think there's been a lot of pushback on losing AGOA, even within the farming community, which has a lot of AfriForum members, right? Because if they lose AGOA, then they won't be able to sell their goods to America. And some of those farmers are large exporters to America. Their whole businesses are based on exports to America. So if Trump cuts South Africa from AGOA now, their products may become too expensive and American consumers will no longer buy them. Because AGOA gives you preferential trade access. You don't pay certain duties and taxes, etc. So that value save can be passed on to the consumer. So now AfriForum has realized that, hey, our constituency is actually a little bit angry at us because of how we've moved. So maybe we need to dial it back and recalibrate our call. And we're going to rather call for not necessarily the aid to be cut, but that they be cuts of trade, but that they be sanctions on ANC leaders. So this is what they had to say.
But basically asking Donald Trump to target ANC leaders. What does that mean for our country? Because this is the leaders of our country you're talking about.
Yes, it means when you push through destructive policies that are going to harm South Africa and regular South Africans, you should face consequences for it. We want the international role players to target with sanctions South African politicians that push through evil and destructive policies, not to punish the citizens of this country. And that has always been AfriForum's stance. As I said, we have the receipts to prove it. You can go through all of our stances on this issue over the years. It's always been punish the politicians that are seeking to push through policy for their own personal agenda and their party's own agenda rather than for the good of the country, and that will bring about the change that's necessary in South Africa.
So I don't know what you think about what AfriForum is calling for, but sanctions typically have not worked, and I don't necessarily know if that's the right idea. So I want to make some closing comments right now to end this video, but to leave us with some food for thought, because this is a developing story. We're going to have to keep coming back to it, right? So the first thing I want to say is that it's interesting to note that the Democratic Alliance has broken ranks with AfriForum and Solidarity. And it seems that they're not going to back them on some of the worst elements of the conversation that has been spread to the Americans, right? So John Steenhuisen has already communicated that he's trying to speak to the Americans and try to tell them what's really happening. Dean McPherson has tried to assure the Americans that as long as he's the one who's the minister, nothing is going to happen that is unlawful, right? So I thought about why is the DA moving like this, and it seems Tony Leon is not necessarily part of that because he's still pushing the radical view, and it seems as if he may be also somebody who Joel Pollack could be listening to or could have listened to in terms of his rhetoric. Obviously, if he's listening to Tony Leon, he probably also listens to Helen Zille. So we'll see how that part goes. But I think part of the reason why the Democratic Alliance itself has kind of walked away from this particular moment and is now trying to move back. Because at the beginning, when President Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Act, John Steenhuisen was there, Tin McPherson, they were like, "Argh!" they were really boiling. And then during the week, they just they moved it back, they dialed it back. And I thought, why are they dialing it back? Why are they doing this? I think it's because of the big donors that contributed from the banking sector. So Michel Leroux, one of the founders of Capitec, right, was one of the big donors to the Democratic Alliance. He donated over 100 million rands over 3 years to the Democratic Alliance. And he would not have an interest in this particular issue going in the worst version possible, because if there are some direct cuts to AGOA, if there are cuts to, some types of aid that the government receives from America, even though it's relatively limited, but it's still significant. And if those things happen, the rand could fall. The rand could fall. Now, when you are a banker, you hold a lot of those rands, right? Not necessarily for your own sake. You hold them on the behalf of other people, but then you use them. Right. And you also, when you become a billionaire as a result of having been a banker for long, you have a lot of rands in and of itself. So if you are a holder of rands, you don't want them to depreciate in value. Particularly, you see, the interest of a miner. Patrice Motsepe is famous for having said that the rand is too expensive in 2008, et cetera, because he's an exporter, right? So he says, I want to sell my phosphate, I want to sell platinum, I want to sell whatever. So, I want a cheap rand. But when you hold the rand, when your value is in rands, right, you don't want the rand to depreciate. So I think that what's happening now is that someone like Michel Leroux has probably given communication to the DA behind the scenes that, listen, I don't want you guys to go down this road because that could potentially devalue the rand. And, we, the markets who sent you guys to this coalition, don't want the rand to fall. So I think that's part of what has happened here. Having said that little comment about the DA, I think that America must be careful about South African and African politics, because they seem to think that they can come to the African space and dictate and demand, and Africans will be like, yes. That's very dangerous. I don't think it's going to happen. It seems that the Republicans are also approaching this topic of expropriation without context of the South African dynamics. And their whole anti-affirmative action position may work for them in the USA. There are people who still debate this anti-DEI stuff. But in America, the majority of the country is white and does sometimes resist discussions around racial justice, social justice, economic justice. They do resist those things. And they feel that they've been in those conversations since 1960 right? However, those dynamics are the opposite in South Africa. In South Africa right now, inequality still prevails. And wealth inequality and land inequality are still largely racial and are still issues that were unresolved after 1994, because CODESA didn't want to touch a lot of these issues. So they kicked the can down the road. So people are feeling frustrated. People want to have some kind of progression towards racial justice, racial solidarity, racial, what can we call it, redistribution. There is still an appetite for that because some of those things never happened. They never happened. So if you come and you actually start trying to insist that, no, you guys need to get in line, you need to support America on A, B, C, D, F, G, we don't like this policy, we want you to change that policy, that could have the opposite effect altogether. And I think it will have the opposite effect altogether on the South African audiences, because South Africans also don't like to be told what to do. That is going to be the response. And in fact, President Ramaphosa has been enjoying a lot of support simply because Paul Kagame tweeted something against him, and now Trump has also said something against South Africa, and that's helping him going into the State of the Nation, because all people are patriotic. It's not just an American thing. So if you come and you're bullying and you seem to be trying to be too aggressive, there will be pushback. And I think that the Americans need to be aware of that this approach, it doesn't work necessarily. And South Africa is another kettle of fish. It's another kettle of fish. And they're willing to lose relationships if you try to push them a certain way. It's not going to necessarily work. Having said that, I don't think it's necessarily desirable to lose AGOA or to lose any benefits that South Africa is getting from America. So I think that the South African business community and diplomatic community must do lots of work. Lots of work is required here to debunk the misconceptions, to create channels of communication that are not these loud and dramatic channels of communication through Twitter, etc., etc. No debate on Twitter is won. All that happens is that people harden their positions and move further into their corners. It's very rare to actually have someone say, oh, I saw on Twitter something and I changed my mind, particularly a public official who doesn't even spend a lot of time reading threads on Twitter, etc., etc. So yeah, something needs to be done here. Something needs to be done. I think the approach cannot be what has happened now. Status quo, Gwedemantashi just saying, no, we're not going to send you minerals, etc., etc. I don't think that is necessarily going to be the right way to handle this issue. We'll see how it is handled. Something I want to say. I did say on the day Trump was inaugurated that the Trump administration was not going to be friendly to South Africa. I said Trump snubs Ramaphosa. I said snubs because Ramaphosa met Elon Musk last year and they were talking about there's a bromance, etc., etc. So if there was a bromance and Elon wanted South Africa to be part of this Trump moment, he would have invited President Ramaphosa and President Ramaphosa would have gone, regardless of the fact that it doesn't happen all the time, etc. Trump does things that don't happen all the time, every day, twice a day, 3 times a day, 10 times a day. That's Trump. That is the nature of Trump. We've seen the Trump movie. I don't have to tell you. You don't have to tell me. You've seen it. We're seeing it. Anything can happen with Donald Trump anytime. He's not a norm conformist in any shape or form. So that's a reality. People came, no, why are you saying snapped? Why are you saying snapped? All I want to say is that I think now it shows that I've been ahead of the curve. I looked at the dynamics, I looked at the facts, and it was very clear to me that there was a snub and that America was not going to be friendly towards South Africa, right? It's not that I like it, it's just what the facts were suggesting at the time, and I thought it's worth looking at. I also said Ndlozi may join the ANC, and people were like, no, how can he join the ANC? What are you saying? He hasn't joined yet, but he was retweeting and praising President Ramaphosa, saying he's ahead of the curve. And he was going against a lot of EFF policy positions in so doing. So think about what that means, about the analysis from the dissection. So I want to close off. My final comment is just that I think Africa must think about our relationships carefully. All of the relationships, because America is moving this way. We must just think about all of our relations carefully. Because the knee-jerk reaction is that, yeah, we'll go to China, we'll look east, we won't sell these guys our minerals, etc., etc. I think that simply looking east is not necessarily a solution and or desirable for the long term. Africa may need to look within seriously and build the systems that it needs to make that a successful strategy. I think the African Continental Free Trade Act right now is still just a paper thing. It's not a real thing. It's not something where if I write and print and publish a book in South Africa, I can quickly get it to Ghana. It's not a reality right now as things stand. I don't want to lie to you. So why am I saying that Africa must think about our relationships carefully? Because simply running into the arms of China, China will smile and take us. But we have to think, does that benefit Africa? For instance, does African manufacturing benefit from substituting German cars with Chinese-made cars? So if there are more Omodas on the road and less BMWs, how has an African country benefited? Is Africa benefiting from the fact that some large Chinese firms, companies, are the ones mining for cobalt in the DRC? So Foxconn makes cell phones for iPhone. But what does that benefit the DRC? Yes, China is there. But what's the benefit of that Chinese presence? China has been one of the countries that has supported dictators on this continent. They've supported Mugabe. They've supported Museveni. They've supported all of these guys. China, Russia too. You know, not USSR Russia, but this Russia, the Putin Russia. They've supported problematic individuals on the continent and propped those regimes up. So when I look at it from the perspective of the ordinary African, if an African political elite tells me, no, we're going against America, we're going to China and Russia. And I'm like, but Russia supports bad guys too. Why is Russia better? Why is China better? I'm saying, not that America is good, or even that this moment is good. I'm saying, as Africans, we need to think about what's good for ourselves and navigate not out of a knee-jerk situation, but proactively in ways that strategically benefit us. If we just become the tennis ball of America and China and Russia, all we get is flung across the court, but that doesn't benefit us in any way because we are not on the scoreboard. We are the pitch that they play for points. We've got to think about that. It's affected Africa in many ways in the Cold War. We don't want to be part of a new trade Cold War between these powers in a way that just hurts Africans. Let's have a conversation. What do you guys think about everything that's playing out? Till the next time.